We're gonna do things a little differently this time. Normally on Sodor 87, my focus is on the locomotives. Yes, I've done some freight cars and some coaches, but every video I've made in this series so far has been about an engine character from the world of Thomas. But rail vehicles aren't the only characters in the Railway series books. Other styles of transportation have had a place in Thomas about as long as the franchise has been around. I wanted to make a few of them just to shake up the formula a little bit, but I didn't think any of them were truly complex enough to warrant their own video. So, what we have today is our first ever Sodor 87 triple feature, and it would appear that our stars are ready to go. Before that though, our channel has its first ever sponsor, and it's Model Railroad Academy. Model railroading is a journey where you're learning something new all the time. Even when I'm not actively working on a project, I want to at least be learning a new technique or something that I can have in my back pocket for later, should I ever need it. Model Railroad Academy is an excellent resource for passionate model railroad enthusiasts of any skill level seeking to enhance their layout. Each video includes step-by-step instructions from seasoned model railroaders like Jerry Leone and Lou Sassy. They have a number of free videos, as well as an expanded premium library for members. I've never been fantastic with weathering, but Bob Rivard's video about the philosophy of weathering helped me figure out how to make Terence look like a proper workhorse. The first 1,000 people watching this video to use the link in my description will get a full year of premium membership to Model Railroad Academy for only $1.49 USD. This offer is valid for new members only, so no funny business, you hear? Enhance your layout with Model Railroad Academy today. Now then, where were we? Ah yes. In the Railway series, we're introduced to a tractor, and a bus, and then a traction engine. There's also a helicopter who was supposed to be in this video, but as it turns out, I'm pretty bad at modeling helicopters in Blender, so I went with something a little closer to home. Terence, Bertie, and Trevor have no exact basis listed for them in either the iOS book or Sodor Reading Between the Lines, and unlike Harold, their illustrations do not appear to mimic any exact real-world vehicle. In fact, their designs vary wildly depending on the illustrator, partly because of how little they actually appeared. Terence bears a healthy resemblance to Caterpillar tractors of the 1920s through the 40s, and Trevor was inspired by Fiery Elias, a traction engine owned by Reverend Teddy Boston, a friend of the Reverend W. Audrey. Bertie, though, is a completely different can of worms. The wiki lists two possible bases for him: the AEC Regal T class and the Leyland PS1. The problem with both of these is that they were platforms upon which different coach builders would build bodies for different buyers. So you can look at two buses that are classified as a Leyland PS1, their chassis will be the same, and their drivetrain will be the same, but their interior and their exterior design will be completely different depending on who exactly bought them, at what time, and from what coach builder. And while there are some buses of those types that have bodywork that's very Bertie-like, I could not find an exact match. Never mind how the wiki doesn't have an actual official source for either of the bases it claims for Bertie. AEC Regal T class they got from the Real Lives of Thomas the Tank Engine website, rest in peace, while the Leyland PS1 they just pulled out of their tailpipe. Like with Percy, I feel that all three of these characters are meant to represent the idea of a type of vehicle rather than any specific model. So I don't think it's unreasonable to headcanon them as whatever specific vehicle you please. I also don't think it's unreasonable to headcanon them as being built by firms based on Sodor. We don't get that big a glimpse into Sodor's non-rail industries in any official material, but we do know that manufacturing concerns do exist, and it is a big island. So I think there's plenty of gaps that we can fill in with our own interesting ideas, like, say, an automotive manufacturer that made a bus platform, which was bought by a company in the Farker area, which contracted a coach builder that once made rolling stock for the TK&E to build a body for it. Or how about a firm in Kronk that once made tractors under license from Caterpillar, and later got bought out by them in, I don't know, the 90s or something. This is one of the reasons why I love the Thomas universe. We have plenty of room to add in our own tidbits to the lore without it seeming unreasonable or fanficky. With that being said, I think it's time that we move on to subject number 1. Woodland Scenics is a brand that's been around for decades and still produces a huge variety of scenic products. Among that is a range of white metal kits that includes a Caterpillar-esque tractor with multiple variants. I bought the front loader variant because a shop had it for cheaper than its other variants. I initially thought I could add the loader parts on as needed if I wanted to, but the attachment points proved unsightly without them, so I just cut those off. After making sure I had all the parts, I removed the castings from their sprues and used a number 11 blade and a file to remove any flashing and burrs. I opted to move the treads forward a little bit compared to the instructions in order to visually balance Terence out a little better and bring him closer to his appearance in the illustrations. I'm sure a tractor expert can tell me if this would significantly affect the weight distribution or anything, but frankly, I don't care right now. To remove residue from the manufacturing process and debris from sanding, I used the sonic cleaner intended for jewelry. It does a much better job at shaking it all loose compared to just rinsing it. A rinse afterwards is still necessary, and occasionally an old toothbrush is needed when particles get lodged in the fine panel lines and stuff, but the sonic cleaner really makes this a much more effective process than just water. Now, part of Terence's signature look are these boards over his treads that I presume are meant to be steps so you don't have to put your foot on the treads when you want to get on the tractor. I made these with a strip of styrene and superglued them to either side, with a small cutout made for the leftover hole from the front loader parts that I would not be using. I opted for Mr. Hobby's black primer on everything you'll see in this video, mainly to darken down their final coats, as opposed to the more neutral gray primer. In theory, this would also cut my painting work in half, except I wound up having to repaint most of the black anyway due to areas being too complex to mask, or because I wanted a different shade of black, like Terence's seat for example, which wound up being both of those. For that I used Mission Model's tire black to emulate an aged vinyl seat. For his orange, I used Mr. Color C59, which is a nice vibrant orange that I've used before on a custom of Bludgeon from Transformers. I applied this via my airbrush and painted the tracks a dark gray by hand. I've based Terence's weathering on photos of old Caterpillars where their bodies have been repainted, but the treads haven't. Which makes sense if you think about how paint flecks would wear off them and poison the groundwater. So leaving them unpainted is a little more environmentally friendly, but it does leave them open to rusting, for which I applied some pigments to the surface of them. Mainly light surface rust, but in some spots I used a medium shade for a deeper seated rust. I only used it sparingly though, as I imagine Terence has still used a decent amount. Naturally, some further weathering was in order. I used some Tamiya panel line wash to get some grime on his moving parts, i.e. his sprockets and his engine, and after that I took the airbrush and used Vallejo's European splash mud weathering effects to get his lower half appropriately muddy. I added some more across his walking surfaces as well with a non-airbrush, and some on his seat for good measure. And after that, I felt he was appropriately dirty, and I was ready to move on. In this instance, I didn't seal everything in with a top coat, but the weathering effects are definitely holding up incredibly well, and honestly I'm not entirely sure it would be necessary at this point. But that is Terence. And now, on to Bertie. Now I'm sure I'm gonna have plenty of people asking why I didn't just use the Bachmann Bertie or a 00 scale model from Oxford or Corgi, and my answer is because I'm doing HO, not 00. They are two different scales. They're close in size, but they're two different scales. And I have compromised in the past by using 009 to represent narrow gauge, 009 being a very fluid scale as it is, but if I can keep something in 1:87 scale, I'm gonna keep it 1:87 scale. Now then, I initially had the thought to draw a Bertie design from scratch and model off of that, as I did for Percy several years ago. But then I thought of something that would be more fun to do this time around. I used the most ancient, primal technique known to man. Bullshit. I literally just winged it using the only thing close to actual schematics that I could find for either of Bertie's proposed bases. I altered the shaping to make it a little more Bertie-like, which included the shape of the windows and the lack of an actual door in the entryway. I did try to keep most of the measurements as nice round numbers when they were scaled back up to full size. So it was calculated bullshit, but bullshit nonetheless. I started with the rough shape of his body and used Boolean modifiers to hollow it out. I planned to assemble it like a typical model car, with the body as a shell atop a chassis, with a separate interior. It took time to figure out the proportions, as this is my first time modeling a road vehicle of any kind, much less a bus. These things tend to have a lot more round edges compared to steam locomotives, and on top of that, Bertie has a very asymmetrical front, which I'd have to figure out how to model, and do the interior for. The wheel arches use a subdivision surface modifier to make them more round, and I opted to make them a part of the chassis for ease of painting. The whole interior would also be one piece as it was on Daisy. The seats are not the most detailed and probably not the most accurate to bus seats of the era, but they work for what I'm doing. Bertie's gonna spend most of his time sitting in the background, and I'd be filling him with people figures before I permanently attach his body to his chassis. Yes, at the moment his three pieces are not glued together as I'm waiting on some figures from Model U to arrive, and heck, I might keep the body separated from the chassis in case I ever want to rearrange the people inside him. Now, as you can probably imagine if you have any experience 3D printing something like this, Bertie wound up being one of those models that takes as long to remove from his supports as it did to model him and put him on the supports in the first place. By the way, if anyone has recommendations for resin slicers that are not Chitubox or Lychee, please drop them in the comments. Now, I wanted to use a different red for Bertie than I've used on everything else in this series. In the books, he's more of a burgundy wine color depending on the illustrator, as opposed to the vibrant red of the TV series. I started by painting his interior a beige color, and then masked off the interior to paint the exterior. However, it was at this point that I started encountering my first real issue that I've had with a Mr. Color paint. Now this is Mr. Color C100 Wine Red, and normally I don't have any issue with their products in the airbrush. Again, I mentioned on Terence that I used their orange. Both times I've used this in the airbrush, it came out with zero issue, as is true for the other Mr. Color products I've put in an airbrush. However, when applying this shade of red to Bertie, anytime I changed the angle of attack, dried paint flecks would start appearing on all of the raised details, seemingly from the overspray. And at first I thought it was an issue with me not cutting out the tape from the windows before I went to paint it. I thought that dry paint flecks were coming off of the sticky part of the tape whenever I went to do another coat of red, but even after taking the masking for the interior out, that didn't seem to change anything. I wound up going through 2 jars of the stuff just to try and get a decent coat on Bertie, and I cleaned him off the best I could of all the dried light paint flecks between coats, and I did my best to sand down the rough surfaces that were happening because of them. But unfortunately, while I did wind up with a decent color, the finish is still very rough and not ideal. Adding a little bit of thinner obviously helped, but it didn't really solve the issue. And again, I don't normally have this issue with Mr. Color paints. Maybe it's something to do with how their wine red specifically is formulated. So as nice as this color is, if I were to redo Bertie, I'd probably look for other options. Oh, and while doing the initial coats, my air compressor decided to take a page out of the Smith's handbook and oscillate wildly until it fell off the table, breaking off its pressure valve assembly. You can still see the stud in there. I do have a spare air compressor, but it kinda sucks. Anyway, after that debacle, I did another coat of beige by hand, and then I moved on to the actual interior piece, as well as painting his lights and radiator silver. Unfortunately, the amount of red paint that I had to use kinda built up a little too much in his taillights, and I couldn't retain their distinct details. You probably won't see him from the rear too much, but the end result here is still a little unsightly. Now, despite the issues I had with that last Mr. Color product, I went ahead and used their semi-gloss top coat on him, and I think it does help smooth out the uneven finish of the paint. The windows, naturally, are just some clear plastic. Now, I also gave Bertie a slot for destination boards. This is not a detail that he has in any official material, but it is something present on a lot of real-life buses, and I think it was appropriate to add. I painted that area black, and then I printed out some boards on cardstock. Now, I am not the biggest fan of using cardstock. In my opinion, it tends to look really, really cheap, but for the purposes of this, it works. It does the job. I also took this time to print out the registration plates I made for him, except at this size, they are way too small to be legible. Yes, this is the correct scale size for them. I based them on the ones used on the Isle of Man, and you can just barely make out the little Sodor and the plate number. Now that is a more modern style plate, but I didn't glue it in place in case I want to swap it out with an older design. Now that being said, I'm not sure how much use I would be able to get out of this if I wanted to record a remake of, I don't know, Bertie's Chase or something, seeing as he cannot roll. I would have liked to make a rolling Bertie, but that's just not possible for me right now. It shouldn't be too hard to rework what I currently have in the future, but at the moment, I am content with this right here. Now there was one more problem that I had. I forgot to give him mirrors. So I quickly grabbed some thin metal and tin snips and just cut out a couple of rectangles. I used a file to smooth out their edges and round their corners, and I took some bent wire and soldered them together. The backs are painted the same silver as the radiator, but I left the actual mirror surface as clean as possible. I'll admit they look a bit big, but hey, it's more visibility for the driver. And at the end of the day, I think he sizes up quite nicely to Thomas. And when you're making a Bertie model, isn't that what really matters? So that leaves us with just one more to go. And we're going somewhere that we haven't gone before in this series. Edward's branch line. Now, as I said previously, Trevor doesn't have an exact basis, but he was inspired by Fiery Elias, which was a traction engine owned by Reverend Teddy Boston, a friend of Audrey. Visually, he doesn't really look like it in the illustrations. That being said, I did still want to use Fiery Elias as the base for him initially. However, I wasn't able to find schematics for it online. What I did find were drawings for a 1-inch scale model traction engine, which I felt were adequate, and I started working off of them, incorporating details from Dalby's illustrations, namely the use of 2 cylinders and a disc flywheel as opposed to Fiery Elias's spoked one. Now, aside from being built around a boiler and a cab, Trevor's design is quite a bit different from a steam locomotive, which took some getting used to, and it especially took me a while to figure out how exactly everything would need to be shaped. And I ultimately wound up looking at some photos of his TV series model as a reference to help me out. I didn't really add any of his controls beyond his reverser and steering wheel. I realized when I was about done painting him that I forgot to give him a brake wheel, and more importantly, I wound up leaving off most of the valve assembly that gets the machine going in the first place. Oh, and by the way, I found during my research that this big block on Trevor and George's sides in the television series is in fact a gearbox. Prior to this, I had thought that traction engines were driven by a belt from the flywheel or something, and now that I know that this is a gearbox, I feel a little bit stupid for not realizing it earlier. The wheels were also quite a bit of a challenge. For the outer parts of the wheel, I was able to use some cylinders with the solidify modifier to get them hollow, but I found doing these kinds of lattice spokes to be a bit tricky. Printing them was another challenge altogether. I had quite a few of these spokes snap off on me and wound up printing a buttload of extra wheels, just in case. There is not a single one of these wheels on the finished model that either A, doesn't still have a support hanging off of its back, and B, I didn't have to glue a spoke back into place. But they are holding their weight, which, I mean, hey, if they're doing their job, then that's a win, ain't it? Now, with that about the wheels in mind, doing the connecting rods was way more of a challenge than they ever were. While I highly doubt I could make moving rods at this scale, I did want them to at least give the appearance of being functional, which meant calculating the distance of their movement, making sure they were quartered, adding in the valve gear. And again, it's not 100% realistic, but I think if I were to show someone who is an expert on traction engines this, I have a good feeling that they might have good things to say about it. The main contender about the realism, at least as far as my knowledge can take me, is the fact that I put the valve gear between the rods here. Now, on a lot of traction engine pictures that I saw, even on 2-cylinder ones, they kept the valve gear linkage on the outside. With how wide my cylinder block is on this, I wasn't sure that would either look good or work at all, functionally. Now, that being said, because my version of Trevor was built on Sodor by a fictional company, I'm not beholden to any of the practices of any real-world companies, so I think I can get away with it. Now, there was a problem that I encountered during printing, and that's the fact that I initially modeled Trevor too small without realizing it. It's a similar issue that I had with Duck, actually. So I had to do some calculations to figure out how much to scale him up, and then I could get a decent print out of him. And again, I printed a buttload of wheels just to make sure that I could have at least some good ones at the end of it. So Trevor's livery in Dalby's illustrations was black with some brass fittings. The TV series depicted him in green with red and black lining, which somewhat resembles Fiery Elias, and I believe that influenced the switch to green in the Clive Spong illustrations of Trevor. Now, I believe I've gone on record with my view on the illustrations. We know that the books exist in-universe, and I don't take the illustrations as literal depictions of events like a photograph would be, but rather an artistic interpretation. So while I try and incorporate details from them, I don't feel myself beholden to them. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of either of Trevor's looks in the illustrations. So with that in mind, I primarily based my Trevor's livery on the TV series, and I used Tamiya TS34 Racing Green as a base. Naturally, I realized after printing that I forgot to add a hitch so he could actually haul plows and carts, so I glued on a couple of little styrene strips and painted them a different shade of green by hand. The wheels would receive a coat of Tamiya XF7 from the airbrush, and the Motion received it from my hand. Both Bertie and Trevor's tires received Mission Model's Tire Black, and after that the wheels were basically done. Now Trevor's base green was already a gloss lacquer, meaning I could go ahead and apply waterslide lining straight on. As with pretty much everything I've done lining for in this series, it's 0.35mm red lining from Fox Transfers. In hindsight, their 0.15mm probably would have worked better for the size of this model, but by the time I realized that, I wouldn't have been able to get it in time. Anyway, after the lining was in place, I painted the boiler bands, safety valve, cap of the chimney, and the rim of the flywheel, using Vallejo's metallic brass. And then I had to redo the lining around the boiler bands because the paint spilled over onto the lining. You can imagine how fun that was to do. After that, Trevor received a satin top coat, also from Vallejo. And once the final coat was on, I gave him some real coal in his bunker, as I've done on all of my steam locomotives, as well as some tiny chains from A-Line that I cut and glued on to act as a steering linkage. Fun fact, those chains were initially meant for my Toby when I first made him years ago, but it just never got around to putting them on him. And now that I can't run him at all, and I'm considering doing a complete rework of him from the ground up, I'm probably not going to put them on him until I do remake him. Of course, that will require high-level kits to start shipping to the US again, so I can get horn blocks and give him a sprung chassis so he doesn't stutter around like Duck does. It's a whole thing. And now, like any good story, this is the point where all of our subplots finally converge. All three of these guys have faces modeled by NWR Chris on Twitter. For Bertie, I was able to use ball bearings for the eyes, although the faces definitely need to be larger, and the ball bearings a little smaller. These ones are 4.5mm, so I'm thinking 4mm might help them fit a bit better. The other two required what I call an eye plate. Trevor because his eyes are so small, Terence because there's literally no space I could put ball bearings behind his face. Now these eye plates are not ideal, but they are easy to make and quick to print, and just require a cutout in the face to install them. I can print a bunch at once and put the pupils in different positions, assuming that I can consistently make neat, round, appropriately sized pupils facing the same direction. My method of using the blunt end of a drill bit dipped in paint is not always perfect. You'll also notice that I did not give Terence his trademark widow's peak. This is because I did not want to paint that. Clive Spong omitted it, Season 21 omitted it, so if you need justification for it, then there you go.
Who am I kidding? I don't need to justify anything to you. You can't tell me what to do. You're not my dad.
And that's one trio of non-rail vehicles done. I'll be honest, Bertie and Trevor needed a little more time on the grill, but I am quite pleased with Terence, especially with how his weathering turned out. I cannot wait for the day I finally have a layout to display these guys on. Special thanks to my patrons over on Patreon who help make these videos possible. They get early access to new videos, an exclusive library of printable files, which Bertie and Trevor will be joining shortly after I touch them up a little bit. If you'd like to support what I do and get some neat bonuses, you can find the link to that in the description. With that being said, I've been Keeper of Toast, and I'll see y'all at the next station.